Gaze reading where the greats drop by. Trendy authors tell us all the who, what, and why. Anyone can listen cause we're spoiler free. Gaze reading from Pulitzer stars to book club picks, where the curious minds can get their fix. So you say you're not gay, well that's okay. There's something for everyone. Gaze reading.
Hello, welcome back to Gaze Reading. I am your host, Jason Blitman, and for those of you who are new, welcome. If you have joined us on Gaze Reading before, welcome back. Thank you for joining us again. New this season, we are on YouTube, so you can watch as well as listen to every conversation that I have with these incredible authors. You can like and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and if you give us a 5-star review, it is so helpful for other book lovers to find us because of the algorithm. And you can follow us on social media at Gaze Reading on Instagram. We are doing a new giveaway every single week exclusively on Instagram, so make sure to check us out there. And on today's show, I'm so excited to have Danzy Senna, who's here to talk to us about her new book, Colored Television, which was just named this month's Good Morning America book club pick. And her publisher, Riverhead, created a really cool Spotify playlist for the book that I'm putting the link to in the show notes. I listened to it all last night, and it's super fun. Also in our show notes, you could find the bookshop.org link. Every book that we talk about on the show can be found for sale on our bookshop.org page. And if you're unfamiliar with bookshop.org, it is a fantastic website where you can buy books and support your local indie bookstores through that website. And on today's episode, we have a fantastic guest gay reader in Jonathan Adler, the designer who I'm sure you've all seen his stuff, been in his stores. And not only does he share the books that he's reading right now, but he also gives us tips for our bookshelves at home. Something that I announced on the last episode is that I am starting a nonprofit to amplify LGBTQIA+ voices that is currently called Outspoken, and you'll be able to know more soon. But if you want to check out weareoutspoken.org, you can put in your email address and we'll shoot you an email as soon as there is more to share. All right, I think those are all the things. Welcome to Gaze Reading, Danzy Senna. This is such a non sequitur. Are you a musical theater fan by any chance?
I am, actually, and both of my kids are really into musical theater. So they were the ones who got me into it. And
oh, how fun.
We're about to go see Strange Loop together. And
No
my
way.
husband is not into musical theater, so it's just always me and my two sons like going in.
That's so cute.
Yeah.
Well, this is so random, but you sort of look like a musical theater performer, and it's like kind of freaking me out. Her name is Eden Espinosa.
Okay.
She's incredible. She's like
gotta look
played
her up.
Elphaba on Broadway. She just starred in a musical on Broadway. She's very talented and gorgeous.
So it's a doppelganger. I like it.
Yes, it's giving doppelganger. But I love that you're about to go see Strange Loop. I loved that show.
Yeah. No, I read it in print, weirdly, for very complicated reasons. I've never seen it except little clips of it. So I'm so excited. Yeah.
No, it's very interesting. I look forward to hearing what you think.
Yeah.
But we're not here to talk about A Strange Loop. Welcome to Gaze Reading. We're here to talk to you about Colored Television, your exciting new book. I don't know if you could see all my
Oh my God.
tabs.
I love seeing that. I love a reader who does that.
Some of them are things to talk to you about, and some of them are things for me to just like have in my mind for the rest of my life. And not talk to you.
Laugh about.
Laugh about / reflect upon.
Oh, good.
I was shocked to feel the like summer thriller that it was to me. I was like, that is not what I was expecting to get myself into.
My goal in life is always to make a novel that's not a thriller feel like a thriller. Like where there are no dead bodies, but like you get the suspense feeling. So that makes me so happy.
Exactly what it was. I was like on the edge of my seat. I sort of wanted to throw up the whole time. But like not in a bad way.
It's so good. That makes me very happy.
Oh, good. For our listeners who have not had a chance to read it yet, what would you say the elevator pitch is for the book?
I would say it's about a failed novelist who tries very hard to sort of sell out and maybe doesn't quite get what she wants out of that experience. She tries to create the greatest biracial comedy of all time in television and move into TV, and it all goes terribly wrong, but in a interesting and entertaining way, I hope. And we get to sort of see what she gives away through the process of trying to elevate her family out of the kind of trenches of the artistic, not quite middle class poverty that they're living in. Yeah.
Speaking of not quite middle class poverty, there's a not quite tip that you give in the book, which is befriend super rich people so that you can house sit for them. And I was like,
Totally.
oh, that's genius.
Yes. No, you become their interesting artistic friend who didn't sell out.
Yes.
And then they eventually always go away, as they do in this book. They always take a year away and they need someone to watch their stuff. So Jane and her family are those friends. And they've been living off this for years, where they're always the subletter or the house sitter for their rich friend. Yeah.
You need those friends too. Right?
Yeah.
Like it's nice to have friends who can watch your things.
Except maybe they don't do it so well. Jane crossing some boundaries while she's house sitting for her rich friend. Yeah.
Well, you don't know that going into it. So as the friend, you think that it's going to be a positive experience.
Right. The wine.
Something that comes up in the book is Jane's students, because she's a professor. Well, she's a professor in quotation marks. I'll call her a professor.
Yeah.
She assigns her students a story that's written in second person, and they're frustrated and upset and offended because they weren't consulted about being the protagonist of that story.
Give consent to be in the second person.
Right. Well, and something that you just said, it made me think about, and that moment in the story too made me realize that none of us have consented to be the protagonist in our story.
Right. Oh, right. In our lived story.
In our life.
Yeah.
Right.
No,
like,
it's the first thing that happens to you. You're born into a life
right.
you didn't consent to.
We did not consent to this.
So
and it's
true.
like, what the hell's going on? And that really made me think about that. And I was like, wait a minute, none of us are consenting to this. We all just sort of landed here.
I hadn't thought about that, but that's like an existential level to this problem.
Really do you remember I said how some of the things I'm going to just reflect on for the rest of my life?
Yeah, you're a really deep reader. I love that.
I try to be.
Yeah, no, I have a story collection called You Are Free. And the line comes from this woman who's about to get an abortion. And she's chanting to her baby or the fetus, you are free, because the only sort of state of freedom she can imagine is not having been born. And that, the sort of moment you're born, you become the object of all these projections, and you have a body you didn't decide on, and you have all this sort of information that comes at you about who you are.
People
so that
are making
title,
assumptions about you.
Yeah, is from that idea, which is so interesting that you read in this as well.
Oh, wow.
I love that.
That is so interesting. Speaking of, maybe things we don't have consent over / control over, there's a big moment in the book that involves, again, a term I will use is psychic.
I mean, yeah, Jane consults early in her life. She consults a psychic, aka a is he called a racial affinity counselor? I'm trying to remember what he is, but he's a psychic she finds. He's online. They have a phone relationship, and he tries to tell her who she's going to marry. And I'm always interested in the kind of danger of psychic readings, because they put all these ideas in your head, and how much do you have a choice then about who you're going to be attracted to based on what they say?
Yeah.
So if they tell you like, oh, a tall blonde is about to come into your life, and then you happen to meet someone and you think you're in love with them, like, would you have been had the psychic not put this idea in your head? And so he tells her she's going to, in the next few weeks, meet a tall black man. I think he's from the West Coast. He's wearing a funny shirt and West Coast shoes, and when she meets this guy at a party, she just goes completely off the rails with thinking this is the one, and to the point where she married him.
Right. Because that has been decided.
Yeah. And just based on this guy she's never met, he's this very sort of hilarious grifter psychic guy.
Right.
And he's very funny, and like he says things, but they, you wonder who she would have married had she not had this reading before this party.
Mm-hmm. Have you ever had a psychic reading?
I have had many, many psychic readings. My mother is a poet, but she was also, like, as a side job, a tarot card reader growing up.
And it's a side job?
Yes. It was.
She did it at like parties?
She did it for friends. Like,
okay.
People, like a lot of people would come to get my mother to read their tarot cards. And
oh my God.
And I think at some point she stopped because she felt that it was dangerous. Like she was sort of implying all these things to people about their lives. And she was maybe realized like this was not a good idea. But I've had psychic readings, and not exactly like the one in the book, but I've had them. And I've wondered about how susceptible have I been to those readings? I stopped a long time ago.
So you clearly have some belief is maybe a strong word, I say in quotation marks, but there's some, I don't know, it's like we read our horoscopes, right?
Yeah.
It's not dissimilar. I don't know.
I mean, it's more fun than therapy is the thing. It's just more fun to see a psychic. And, it's less work. There's less having to look into your own soul. But I had one actually.
And probably cheaper.
And it's something I share with my sister and my mother, and we kind of give each other as gifts. There's this one guy that we've been seeing on and off for years. And he's kind of more of a poet than a psychic. But I like the way he interprets the world and describes things. But he told me years ago, during like 2020, he said that Trump was not going to win the election, but that his constituency had been awakened and was here to stay. And he said, whatever you do, Danzy, he said, you're going to think you want to move to the country. You're going to think you want to move to the woods. Whatever you do, do not move to the woods. He was like, stay in a liberal bubble. And like, I haven't moved to the woods. I'm still living in a small neighborhood. And he said, stay near the cities, stay near people. It was like a terrifying reading. And it stuck in my head. So I sit.
And here we are.
Here I sit in multicultural Mayberry.
Yes, the dream.
The dream is alive in multicultural Mayberry. Yeah.
Yeah. I know you also were a New York to California convert.
Yes.
And we are quite sold on California living.
Oh, good. I love hearing that. I'm really never looked back.
Yeah. I know. I'm like, I have one tattoo, and there's a part of me that's like, I kind of want to get like a California pride tattoo. Like, I love California. I'm a complete
disciple. No, I'm like a cult member about California.
Oh, I'm so glad.
I feel it's like a huge part of my identity, and LA and Southern California in particular. Like the Bay Area is different. It really.
How long have you been here?
I've been here for 18 years in LA, and
oh wow,
it's been great. But I've had a relation. I went to college up north, actually in the Bay Area, and that was sort of the beginning of my obsession with California and wanting to move here, and kind of like. LA is a really strange place. It's much more urban and has all these issues, but I find it like such an interesting, enigmatic place to live. Like I'm never stopped being interested in the idea of LA and the reality of it because it's foreign to me. Like if I had moved to London, it would be a lot more familiar to me than moving to California. It's another country in many ways. So
London is more like New York City.
Yeah. Paris is more like New York City. Like this is, I think, I don't know if I have this in the book, but at one point I thought this is the opposite of Europe. There's very few places I could say are the opposite, and this is the opposite.
Well, which is funny too, because there's so much topography that's very European.
Yeah.
Right. Like it feels very Italian, feels very like there's
between houses you can move from country to country because we had a friend visit from Paris and she was like, there's there's no coherence to this thing. You know, there's what decisions were made about this as we're driving through neighborhoods. It was just such chaos. And I was like, oh, that's maybe why I feel so at home here, because it's so chaotic, just like me.
Controlled chaos,
Yeah.
perhaps.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so
I think
funny.
Jane says at one point, like, she feels she's never been somewhere where she felt more alone or more free, or she says this is what she feels about LA. You know, I think it can be a lonely place, this landscape. It's the Wild West. The sky is really big. There's a kind of space between things, but there's also a lot of freedom in that. And yeah.
And that, for me, is sort of where New York and LA intersect.
Oh.
The people that I came across living in New York, people that I've lived with, friends of mine, they moved to New York because they wanted to be a part of the best, and yet it was also a tremendously lonely place. And
Oh,
I think
really?
in LA, people move there to like be in film and TV, to be a part of the best, but it can be a very lonely and isolating place. And I think
Yeah.
that's a very similar
I think that's
experience for both
true.
people.
Yeah, no, and it's a different kind of loneliness. Like New York, I was seeing people all the time, and I couldn't kind of filter the world as well as I can here. And here you can really curate like how much you engage with the world. And so that's preferable for me as a writer.
Right.
Yeah.
Of course, right. Being able to sort of like open and close the valve as you need.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah. Versus it like shoving itself in your face.
Yeah.
Right.
I just spent 2 weeks in New York, and it was like, I was like, these people, how do they keep going? Like the party just never stops. And I get overstimulated. Like I need to go into like one of those little cocoons or something after that much engagement with the world.
I know. Whenever my husband and I go back, I'm just like, how did I do this for so many years? This is insane.
I'm so glad you got out, because I feel like if you want to leave New York and you don't, it can really curdle. Like it can go really bad. It's the Joan Didion goodbye to all that moment that, you know, you've got to listen to that if you're ready to leave.
Yeah, no, I cannot wait to see you at the cult meetings. So
I love that you're as much a disciple as I am. Very few people are.
So Colored Television is like such an LA book, but it's also such an artist book. It's a writer book. So Jane is staying at her friend Brett's house, and she uses his office, and she has this moment of feeling like she's going to be able to finish her novel because of the space, because she can sort of create this like call to prayer that she's curated for herself. Do you have that for yourself? Do you have a call to prayer?
Well, I actually write outside of the house in a library. And that's my kind of call to prayer, is that I have to feel like the first draft of a novel or a story. I really need to be in a very specific place, in a specific seat. And I have a little cubicle at this library. It's like a research library. We have to have a special allowance to go. And I have 2 friends who work there. So it's like we have like our little coffee clutch. But it's for me, you know, signaling that I'm in a specific chair that turns on that part of my brain. I really feel your life has to get really boring to write a novel, and that's one of the reasons.
I won't tell your husband or your kids.
Well, LA is, I know that they've allowed for a lot of dull moments. Actually, they're very exciting. That's part of why I have to leave the house. That's why I have to leave. But routine and ritual being sort of really essential to my writing process. And like not having lunch with friends, only having dinner. Like there are certain things that will kill your novel very quickly. And, you know, one of them is like being a lady who lunches.
Have you ever gotten into a fight with someone who's sitting in your cubicle?
Yeah. Well, I once went to usually it didn't happen. I went there one day and there was a woman sitting in my cubicle who looked like me, except younger and better. And my friend.
And now she's dead.
No one's ever seen her again. I waited until she went to the bathroom. But like that was very disconcerting for me. And she was like sitting there reading and taking notes on a novelist I know. Like it was eerie. It was definitely creepy. Like she had come to take my identity. So
that is weird.
But it hasn't happened again. My second novel, I wrote the first draft in a year in Brooklyn, going to the same cafe every day in my car, and I had a rule that I could only write scenes forward. I couldn't edit. And I only had 2 hours on my meter, and I would go to sit at the same table for 2 hours, and I had to leave it wherever I was. But it really was a model for how I've written since then. Is kind of
that like routine thing is very powerful for you.
Yeah. And also creating a limit on how long you spend with that work so that you're not, it's not this sort of depressive space that just goes on and on. And I have children and a job and life and
Right. Yeah, shit to
other
do.
things. But like keeping it in its place in a way has been increasingly important for me.
Yeah.
And
Oh,
not,
that's really interesting. And there just isn't time to procrastinate, right? It's like,
yeah. You're
this is
like,
your
I got
allotted
the
moment to do
clock's
this
on.
thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I
Oh,
think
that's
it's
really cool.
helpful in terms of just the mental illness that can descend on you if you work on a novel. These are ways to fend it off, you know.
Sort of in line with what you just said. Jane, talks about
You're gonna get me in trouble.
Jane talks about how when she goes out on the road to peddle her book and how exhausting that can be, how she has to cultivate a persona in order to persevere, basically. How would you describe your persona when you are like capital A author mode?
I mean, one thing that I realized was interesting about New York for me was that I felt I was too much in author mode all the time, and I wasn't enough able to be a writer with the quiet, private self. And the dreaming self, it's like you're in a dream when you're writing. And New York was always waking me up. And this is going back to our cult of California, where I felt LA is just like you're always dreaming here. You're driving and you're dreaming and you're walking and you're dreaming. And so this has been much more productive for me as a writer than New York City. But in terms of the author persona, you know, I think part of my problem maybe is that I don't have I need to sort of get like crazy hairdo or something that will like be like a good caricature if someone was to draw me, because I don't sort of have
what would the caricature be?
I don't know. Like I don't have enough of a zany detail about me.
I do love the big glasses. They're really working.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll get even bigger ones. I think I need something to make me a persona, a caricature.
Maybe you need to do the opposite. Maybe you need to go get a caricature so that someone else can show you what your thing is.
I do. I think there should be a job for people to help someone brand themselves as an author, because I don't have social media. I'm really from the dark ages in terms of how I live my life. So I haven't done a lot of persona building. But one of the things I actually was exploring in this book was the appeal for me of television writing and film writing, but more even television writing, was the idea of being an anonymous writer and just because I get such pleasure out of storytelling and so much pleasure out of writing, but I don't get that much pleasure out of the selling the work and the sort of, you know, this is fun, but I don't get as much fun out of when it comes time to like peddle your wares. And that's a more complicated experience for me. And I kept thinking, well, if I was just in a writer's room, like being funny and thinking up cool episodes, I could just reduce writing to this thing that's so much more anonymous. And it's less, there's been, you know, I think I also have the complex thing of being a mixed race woman who is, every time I publish a book, that has to be a conversation. And, you know, my work deals with that directly. In some ways, that's the material I'm working with. But that is another level of exhaustion that I think like Jonathan Franzen wouldn't have to deal with. I get asked the sort of questions around who I am in a way that's much more sort of specific to me than someone else might. So there's some things about being an author that I could live without. But I love writing novels, so here I sit. You know,
and the fact that you even started this conversation by talking about in New York, you were you had to lean into author and you weren't able to be writer. And I don't think I've ever thought about it that way. And of course, it makes so much sense that capital A author versus writer that's really not the same experience sort of day to day.
Yeah. And I don't think it's ever been as intense to be an author in terms of what you have to do. And in terms of social media in particular, like that is added a whole level of persona building that, it didn't exist even when I first started publishing in the 90s when I first wrote. So it's changed a lot.
Yeah.
And I really understand the like Elena Ferrante thing of just becoming anonymous, because I think that protects you in a certain way that being out here doesn't.
And do you know Chuck Tingle, the author?
Mm-mm.
He does some YA and some like queer fantasy horror stuff, but his thing is he wears a mask.
No, he literally, not metaphorically.
No, he has like a pink paper bag that he puts over his head, basically, and like
no one's ever seen him.
No,
I love that. No, I think people are going to have to start getting more creative. That might be my persona, but it's too late. I messed it up already, so here I sit.
Well, put the bag over your head with the fun big glasses, and then you'll lean into it, and it's fine.
Okay.
How you're talking about the things that authors, capital A authors, have to talk about over and over and over again with their books. I've talked to a lot of authors. I've done a lot of in-person author events, and I don't like going to them because they're boring. Yeah. Books should be accessible and shouldn't be stuffy, and there shouldn't be these barriers to entry.
Oh yeah.
And I find it so challenging when we, in quotation marks, present books to be this elite thing. Right. And when you're talking about like process and the themes and the this and the that in the book, then unfortunately it does put that barrier to people who really just want a good story.
Yeah. And I think, that was something I when you were talking about the thriller aspect to my work, like I find that I always want to write the book that I would want to read and that would draw me in. And those larger ideas have to be entered sideways, and you have to have the pleasure aspect of reading. And I think of reading as, should be sort of a democratic thing, like that and the way that television and, even like prestige television has succeeded in making just such a wide swath of people enter these stories and feel that these characters are real and really enter the dream. So I want to always have that space where I feel anyone could enter my work, and they don't have to have a graduate degree, and they don't have to, be coming at it from that level, but they're still going to get something out of it, and they're going to have fun on that ride, and they're going to, be in on the joke in a sense.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, my background is in theater, and I would always get in trouble because I'm the one in the room saying, we're just putting on a play. People are dressing up and singing songs, and we're putting on a play. Like, the work can be important, and people can take something from it that can change their life. But the actual work we're doing isn't physically in the moment saving lives. And so let's just have a good time.
Yeah, no, and I think this book for me, like I was like the most sort of aware that I was like leaning into pleasure and joy in the writing. I was like, I think people need like to laugh a little at this moment in history and to be sort of having a good time in the reading experience. And there's so much competing with books too, that if you're boring, nobody's gonna want to read you.
No.
Don't bore us. Yeah.
And, something that Jane is going through in color television, she essentially, I mean, not essentially, she's faking it till she makes it. And the joke is on all of us because that's what we do, because we don't have a rule book, because none of us consented to being the protagonist of this story.
Right, exactly. No, she is totally. It's all a, kind of a con. And writing a novel is a con. I mean, you're trying to make people believe in people who don't exist. You're trying to make yourself believe in these people. It's like you're Frankenstein, Dr. Frankenstein. You're trying to bring this monster to life. Use that idea in here and get a heartbeat and a pulse, make their eyes open. And that's for me the fun of it. And I never think an idea can save a story. Like the story has to be the thing that drives the story, and the ideas have to. And as the novelist, I often don't even know all the ideas that I'm playing with, and that's as it should be. I sort of let my subconscious do that work. And I
in
try
those
to
2
focus.
hours
Yeah.
while the meter is running.
I get a parking ticket. I do that
Yeah.
work. Yeah.
And Jane, I think, all of us find faking it till you make it to be a little overwhelming and perhaps unrealistic, but Jane sort of gets joy out of being able to play pretend. And it made me think about, when is pretend no longer pretend?
Yeah.
When is faking it till you make it no longer faking it?
Or
are you always faking it?
No, exactly. I mean, I've had that question in my work for a long time, because my first novel was about kind of a character who has to pass as white, and she's doing it thinking it's just to get a certain thing for her and her mother, but she wonders at what point over the years and years she has to do this, does she actually become white? With Jane, it's coming out in this other way of like, at what point will she kind of be able to fake her way into the middle class, the bourgeois class of television writers, and will she sort of convince this producer that she can make this show? And she's also lying to her husband. He thinks she's still a highbrow novelist in that room that she goes to, and she's not working on that novel at all. So she's involved in multiple deceptions. And that, for me, deception is like the lifeblood of fiction, like the lie that makes the story go. The more lies you can pile up, the better when you're writing. Yeah.
That's a really interesting concept. So you've just been lying to us for, 280 pages.
Yeah.
But
I mean,
right, because that's true.
Yeah, it is.
It's building that world.
And if you're not lying and you're trying to write a novel and you're basing it too much on your own life, then you end up hitting a wall. And I think if you're writing about, say, a woman who is your mother, and everything about this character is your mother, you're going to be limited in the fiction you create, because you're either going to be too angry at your mother and trying to get revenge on your mother, or you're going to be too loyal to your mother. But either way, that's not about the story on the page. So you want to kind of find a place where you don't feel this is your mother anymore, and the story can begin to take over, and not your own petty gripes or your past traumas, but something else happens in that process, which I call like fictive distance, where you find this distance from the character. And I had to do that with this book because, she's a writer in LA. She's got the same racial mix as me. She's married to a creative person and has 2 children. And I had to sort of find my way toward who is this character who's not me. And that was really where the story started to come to life.
There's a piece of advice that Jane gives to one of her students that, of course, I didn't write down.
Make it worse.
Make it worse.
Yeah,
right.
Yeah.
And I felt you doing that throughout the book in a fun, meta, exciting way. I was like, oh my God, Danzy like went there and we really taking us to these extremes in a satirical but also like real life sort of way.
Yeah.
And it had me thinking, like, is Hollywood in on this joke? Because we all know that this is how things function, and it's satirical in quotation marks, but this is also real.
It's kind of another Wednesday in Hollywood, I feel.
Right.
Yeah, I don't think it's funny. It's satirical. Like, there's definitely social sort of comedy going on in my writing always. Like, it's definitely comedic. But I think I'm never sure if I'm actually writing satire, because especially when you're living in Hollywood, because it's already so over the top.
Right.
And
right. Exactly.
Yeah. Like I don't know if it's possible to satirize it.
Right. I was like, is she making it worse, or is she just telling the truth?
Or making it better, maybe.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Seriously.
There's that line I'm always looking for, but I definitely, with my students, if they turn in a story and they've been sort of protecting their characters too much, because that's the other thing that can happen if you're not writing characters that aren't you to protect them too much. I do say that to them, make it worse. Like, what's the bad thing that can happen here? Because I'm bored. Like, something bad has got to happen. There's got to be a problem, or why are we
And then
here?
it's fun to watch them climb out of that.
Or not, but like,
or not, but at least there's something interesting.
It's pleasurable. that's the thing, is in fiction it's pleasurable. In real life, not so much.
Well, that's why, like I said earlier on, it made me want to throw up, but not in a bad
In a
way.
good way. In a good way.
Right. Right, exactly. You know, you said earlier, so much of your writing is about race. Everybody talks to you about race. You feel like you have to explain yourself and talk about yourself in all of these conversations. We don't need to go down those paths. There were a couple things in the book that I really resonated with. And as Gaze reading, I think really resonated with me in particular. One thing, the idea of representation in art deemed a commercial success so rarely depicts minorities as just living.
Yeah.
And
And gay characters too. Yeah.
right,
Any
right.
marginalized group.
Any marginalized
Yeah.
group as just being, right? And I really, I've been so moved reading and consuming queer content of just like romances or like people falling in love. And then that's sort of it. But so much queer content is coming out trauma, dying of
Yeah.
AIDS, parental trauma, lots of trauma. And the concept of sort of someone who looks different than a run-of-the-mill cis straight white person
Yeah.
has to go through some trauma in order for that art to be successful. And
Yeah.
you putting
So
that on the
true.
page really meant something to me.
That's great, because it's funny. I think even though everything you're saying is totally resonating, I think people, whatever I write, they're always going to read it as being, even when you don't write that story, they're going to read that story into it. And for me, Jane is not conflicted about her biracial identity at all. She's trying to make money off of it. She's trying to grift off of her racial identity, but she's not conflicted. She's just trying to make money. And the money issue is a much more sort of driving force in her life than any kind of betwixt and between tragic mulatto thing. Like, she's just like, how can I spin this to get us a house in multicultural Mayberry? And I think, you know, there's that line between, you're not trying to write a cis white character, straight male character. Like, the race and the gender and all these things will come into the story, but they're not going to be, they're the geography of the story. They're not the plot of the story. And that always is a really big difference for me, is the people in my story are usually Black and biracial, and, you know, there's fewer and fewer white characters in the story, centered in the story, but the people are these things. And so race is part of the humor, it's part of the landscape, it's part of the way they see the world, but it's not the plot. It's not the central conflict here.
Right. And it'll be interesting. I'm very curious to talk to other people, because I know that immediately there is this white fragility where people are going to be like, this is a book about race, and it made me understand things in a way that I didn't before. And I was like, this is a book about art and power and wealth discrepancy and so many things where, you know, as you said, Jane is sort of using her mixed race to sort of create this fantasy for herself. And that's what it's about. And so yeah, I'm excited for people to sort of dig into that in a different way.
But I love, what you're talking about, because I do think it's something that I have so many, you know, students of different backgrounds and different marginalized identities, queer, trans, you know, Latinx, all sorts of backgrounds. But I think all of us have that same issue that comes up when we're creating art. And that is, you know, and that's why I try to really write toward, in terms of audience, toward the smallest, most intimate circle. I don't think outside of my little bubble of early readers and family and people who are really don't require that translating and understand the joke on the most sort of deep inside baseball level, because that sort of protects it from me stepping outside of myself and doing that other work.
Right. Yes,
it's
exactly.
a trick, because ultimately you have to deal with that outside world. But while I'm writing, I try to create, and it's easier in California to do that. Go back to our cult to create that bubble.
Oh, I'm sure.
Because you're just in your car and you're just walking to your door. You know?
Right. One other thing I want to ask you about is Jane talks about her inciting incident in her life and how getting a phone call really changed her life. What was yours? What was that thing that sort of made you who you are today?
Oh, an inciting incident. I
You're
mean,
like, I don't have to do this for myself usually. It's for my
I
character.
know, I know. I mean, there's so many inciting incidents for
Yeah.
various trajectories we go into. But I think what my first thought when you asked me that was my failures have been the inciting incidents. And those failures that at the moment feel like a crushing blow, they kind of open up some other door for you that you didn't expect. And I think of both. I went into college trying to be pre-med, and my first semester I profoundly failed my chemistry and math. And it was like, okay, I guess I'm just going to study literature and go back to the
The
family
child of
business.
the poet.
Yes.
Right.
And, and then I think about, I still didn't want to be a creative writer. And I went to work for Newsweek right after college when there were still magazines. And I worked in Midtown at a magazine as a fact checker. And I was probably the worst fact checker they'd ever had. And I was like, maybe I'm actually a fiction writer because it sounds true. And therefore I believe it's true. And so I think then I started to write fiction on the side. And I think of all these moments that like I tried something else and failed as being the thing that incited the really positive trajectory, which isn't always how we think about failure, but
No, but it's a nice reminder.
yeah. And you kind of look for what's the opportunity that this failure is opening up for you. It's the space it's creating for you. Every novel, you have to be willing to fail to do any creative work. Like that's part of the job is to fail. Like Samuel Beckett says, fail better, and you're just, you have the perfect idea of the novel you're trying to write. And then sort of the real novel happens on the way to writing that. And so you have to be willing to just kind of keep allowing those other surprises to happen on the way.
Yeah. Was there something that happened during the process of writing color television that comes to mind?
Well, the pandemic happened about 100 pages into this, and I put it in a drawer for 2 years. So that was not a good. I literally had started this. I was on fire. I was writing this book, and 2 years, my kids were home. And everything was falling apart. And I was so worried when I went back to it that I wouldn't be able to get that sort of fire again. And I actually think that some of the things I was doing in those first 100 pages, I saw clearly the other way to do this when I came back to it. And at least this is what I'm telling myself, that it's a better book because of that break, because I couldn't quite find the fictional distance on it until I had some time to let it percolate.
I talk to authors all the time who are like on deadline and there's no wiggle room. And if they had some more time, the things they feel like they'd be able to do with it. So I think that's a terrific example of a failure during this book.
Yeah.
I mean, not a failure on your part per se, but like it was a huge roadblock.
An obstacle. For real.
A huge obstacle. Right.
Yeah. And I'm sure there's
we certainly
like
wouldn't have the book we have today.
Right. And I think there's a lot of, if you write things that are, as I've said, like too close to you still, and then you don't see where this character is different from you, how things can go differently. That's where, what I got out of that 2 years was that distance.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Danzy Senna, thank you so much for being here today. Everyone go get your copy of Colored Television. It's juicy and delicious and thought-provoking and a joyful, thoughtful experience to read. And I can't wait for everyone to check it out.
Thank you so much.
Have fun on your author tour, putting on your big glasses.
I'm going to. I'm getting bigger.
Yes. Thanks, Danzy.
Thank you.
You are my first guest gay reader who I haven't made out with, who I don't share a bed with. I guess I could say yet, right? Life is short.
The sesh is still early.
The sesh is early. Who knows?
Yeah.
My husband was my first guest gay reader. And today's guest gay reader, for our listeners, you might know him from his bright colors, his bold patterns, his giant pills might be a hard pill to swallow. And what Katie Couric says, vases covered in breasts, but what I would call boob vases or boob lamps. The one and only Jonathan Adler. Welcome to Gaze Reading.
Hello. I'm so happy to be here. I am a gay who reads.
Well, which is hilarious. I didn't even know that when I reached out about you coming on the show. And I was like, okay, this is a guy who, if anything, he has beautiful bookshelves and he's designed beautiful bookends. But then you go on in interviews to talk about how you used to not be a fan of magical realism in fiction. You've written books. You've talked in interviews about reading Stefan Zweig novels. I'm like, oh, Jonathan Adler is a capital R reader.
Yeah, one can't call oneself an intellectual because it sounds super duper pretentious, and I hate that. But not saying, just saying. I kind of, I pretend to be a fluffy and superficial designer, but I'm actually sort of a brooding, pessimistic, like Eastern European Jewish intellectual. Like my husband always says that I'm sort of a frothy mix of like a light, fluffy pop starlet like Ariana Grande and Franz Kafka. So he calls me Ariana Kafka. And that's kind of who I am.
And we'll get to what you call him in a second. But Jonathan Adler, what are you reading right now?
Right now, it's funny you say that. Like this morning, I actually just finished Long Island Compromise by Taffy Brodesser Akner. Which, have you read it yet?
Not yet, no.
You will.
I have not read it. She turned down the podcast, so I haven't yet, but I will read it.
Oh, I hate that. Like I hate when you have personal beef with somebody because it kind of fucks up their but it's an incredible book.
I will say it's not personal beef. And the reality is that I just need to prioritize the people who are on the podcast. So that's all it is. It's not beef. It's not beef. But okay, I'm grateful that you also said oeuvre on today's episode because you've said it in other things. And all I wanted to do was hear you say that word.
Oh, you're welcome. And then I actually this is sort of germane to what we were just saying. I actually just started All Fours by Miranda July, which has been sort of like, I think the book of the summer for some, but I have resisted reading it because probably 20 years ago, a friend of mine was like dating some guy and he left her for Miranda July. So I've never met her. She has no idea who I am. Like there's nothing. But I've always had this sort of vestigial, like beef with her. And then I was like, wait, this is ridiculous. I've never met this woman. I'm sure she's lovely. This all happened 20 years ago. And I bet the guy who broke up with my friend was right. Sometimes, I think Miranda July actually is probably just better than my friend. So he made the right call. It's sort of like when my mommy was working in New York at Vogue in the 50s. She was writing People Are Talking About at Vogue, and she got fired and replaced by Joan Didion. And I'm like, well, they were right.
Yeah, but the amount of beef that you're racking up with literary figures.
I know. Like, I shouldn't have beef with Joan Didion, but being a great, great person with a very charitable heart, I'm open to Didion. And now I find myself open to Miranda July. Yeah, no beef.
Good for you. Do we know if the guy is still with Miranda July? We don't know.
I don't think so. This all happened like so many centuries ago. And I doubt my friend would even like remember, but it's just sort of one of those things that's like just, a nagging little detail in my life. Yes, it's in the back of my brain somewhere, but I'm moving past it.
Amazing. I was just talking to the author Danzy Senna on this episode earlier about her book, Colored Television. And we talk a lot about sort of faking it till you make it and how that's like a thing that we sort of all have to do in real life. And something you have said is that there's a version of design. Do you think that that's like what decorating is? Is decorating like faking it till you make it?
I mean, I guess really everything is. I think that's the lesson of adulthood is that nothing is real. And there are there's no experts. It's all kind of just a bunch of kids putting on a show. Nothing's real. So we're all faking it until we make it. That's just kind of life. And,
It is the thing I am shocked by the most as I get older. I'm just like, oh, nobody actually has an answer. And it's scary.
Yep.
Like, even when you go to the doctor, you're like, wait a minute, you don't actually have all the answers like I thought you did.
Literally nobody knows what they're doing. And, luckily I have sort of a bit of intellectual hubris. So I think I always know what I'm doing. And, I think at this point you have to, even in like a medical sit, you have to be an advocate. And chances are you might actually have a better idea than the doctor, him or herself, because, you just might.
There's also the committing to it. If you sort of commit to the thing,
Yeah,
you sort of believe it, right?
that helps. Yeah, I think though I always struggle to sell myself in a serious way because I find that super embarrassing.
Mm.
Like people who take themselves super seriously, I find mortifying. Like I think you should always be extremely self-deprecating, and that doesn't exactly like you don't really want a doctor who's self-deprecating. Doesn't inspire
Right.
confidence. But I find I find that being self-deprecating rather than grandiose is infinitely more charming. So that's kind of how I roll.
Doctor, lawyer, maybe anything else can be self-deprecating, but those two things, like, I really need them to be serious. You have said in some of your other interviews, you got your hands on clay for the first time at 12. We talk again with Danzy Senna about her inciting incident for sort of her life, becoming a writer. You were at summer camp. You got your hands on clay, but what got you to the clay?
To be honest, it was the super duper hot pottery counselor. He was an Adonis. And I was like, yes, I will take your class. And then I'm not going to say that I, suddenly just fell for clay and forgot all about him. But it was I had space in my heart for the counselor and for the clay. And the clay,
That actually was his name.
Yeah, if only.
Click.
The counselor is now just like a distant fond memory, but the clay remains in my heart.
Yes, but without that counselor, you would not be who you are today. So let's give a little thank you to not clay counselor Clay.
Yes, thank you, hot, not clay counselor guy.
I'm obsessed. Okay, so we've talked about what you have just read, what you're currently reading. What is your current quick read? What is your hot take? What are you kvetching about? What are you complaining about these days?
Obviously, my husband, always.
Listen, I knew very little about you prior to preparing for today. And the thing that I think I relate to you the most is your frustration with your husband and how Slyman does things and then does them so freaking well. And in turn, your smear campaign no longer is successful.
That's the life. Like, I think the whole reason to get married is to have somebody to blame. Unfortunately, my dad died 25 years ago. My mom, for a while had a boyfriend, and then he died. And I was like, hey, how are you doing? And she said, no, it's awful. But I find the biggest problem is that now I don't have somebody to blame for everything. My Slyman and I have been together for 30 years. And of course, I blame him for everything. But the truth of the matter is, I made a huge mistake. And my mother made a similar mistake. My mom always said that my dad, she made the mistake of marrying somebody who was brilliant and of unimpeachable character, and kind of there was just nothing she could say wrong about him. And history repeats itself. I have made the mistake of marrying somebody who's brilliant and who is of unimpeachable character, and likable and charming and just better than me. And so it leads to just every day I feel, less than. He makes me feel less than. And, to anybody listening, like the lesson is do not marry someone of unimpeachable character who's very talented.
I know.
It's annoying.
It's so annoying. It's so frustrating. So I'm here for you. I'm obsessed with how much of a reader you are. Is there something that you would recommend to someone who's looking to maybe spice up their bookshelves that they should add to their shelf? What makes a gorgeous bookshelf?
I don't know. That's the eternal question. And it's an evolving question as well, because bookshelves used to be for books. Remember them? And it's not only that people have gotten dumber and less literate, although that's a big part of it. It's that we've also all gone virtual. Like I read on my iPad. Often,
Mhm.
like to support my local bookstore, I will buy a book and then download it. So I double dip, but just
Yeah.
because I feel guilty. So bookshelves now are as much for display as they are from books. Like they used to tell the story of your life. I grew up in a house that was groaning with books, and you're probably too young to know this, but there used to be, probably in everybody's house, like this one shelf where there was a dictionary that was like on sort of a slanted,
Yeah.
thingy, and
Like a
you would just
stand.
go to it
Yeah.
all, yeah, stand thingy,
Mhm.
and you would just go to it like all day, every day, because you couldn't just like kind of put your finger on the thingamajig and let the uh, look up function happen. So, and I think actually looking things up in a dictionary probably was a little more effective and lodged it in your brain more effectively than digital
Yeah.
solutions. Anyway, whatever. The bookshelf conundrum. Really? Bookshelves have now become sort of a case study in composition. Uh, they're very, not unlike an Instagram thing. You have a very clear and discrete space to work with, and you look at it dead
Mhm.
on. And it's really, playing with your bookshelf is a great way to hone your compositional skills. Of course, the basics of arrangement are the power of odd numbers. So, if I always like to have sort of a
Oh.
rhythm of books, some stacked, some upright, perhaps an objet
Mhm.
on a stacked book. You can always think about repetition as a display strategy. You can think about the
Oh.
power of odd numbers, like grouping objet in odd numbers, and symmetry.
Mhm.
So bookshelves are actually, there's no right answer, but they're strategies for approaching them. And I think one needn't feel guilty about not having a ton of books anymore, because in the past, if you didn't have a lot of books, it would brand you as like a moron. And now you can lie and just say you have them on your iPad,
Right,
when
you're
really
just a
you're just like
minimalist.
right. Really, you're actually just like a dumb gay who's watching, some stupid Bravo series the whole time.
And everyone they could buy an objet at Target or at jonathanadler.com. There's a fantastic artist, Trevor Wayne, who is Palm Springs's biggest Jonathan Adler not distributor, but he sells the most Jonathan Adler things in
Oh
the Palm
yes,
Springs
yes, yes, yes.
area.
Of course. Yay.
He's lovely. Thank you so much for being here, for being a guest gay reader. I'm obsessed that we don't ever think of you perhaps as a reader first, but you are. You're very much a reader. We love.
I'm very much aware. Speaking of Wayne, you just mentioned Wayne. I just have two other book recs from this
Yes,
summer.
please.
The Winner by Teddy Wayne is amazing.
Oh,
Have you not read it? I don't know. It should be like the book on
I've
everyone's list.
never
Everyone
even
should be talking
heard
about
of
it.
it.
It's Shut Up. Um, it is sort of like
No.
The Winner by Teddy Wayne. It's sort of like The Graduate meets The Talented Mr. Ripley, I would say. And then I got so into this Teddy Wayne book. He's a brilliant writer. Um, and I then read his previous book, which is called Loner, which is kind of like it's sort of a stalker kind of vibe, but he writes literary fiction, I would say,
Yeah.
accessible literary fiction. And Loner is fantastic as well. So 2 books by Teddy Wayne, The Winner and Loner. You're welcome.
Thriller, suspense, crime fiction, coming of age story. Fantastic. Highly recommend All the Colors of the Dark by Chris Whitaker. Falls in that. It would be on the same shelf in the bookstore, so you'd probably enjoy it.
I'm listening. All right.
Fantastic. Jonathan Adler, thank you for being here.
Thank you so much.
Can we
It's such
find
a
you
pleasure.
somewhere? Where can people find you? On the social medias?
JonathanAdler.com. Yeah, on the social medias, which is like, it's my company social media. I'm sort of like, I'm just a lurker on social media, but so you can see all my my corporate social media stuff at Jonathan Adler on all the platforms, and of course JonathanAdler.com, and any of my many retail establishments. And
Yes.
check me out, bitches.
And
Thank
this is a
you.
very important note for our listeners. If you taught pottery at a summer camp a bit of years ago,
Apple Farm.
It
was Apple Farm in probably 1979.
Please
Apple Farm
email
1979. Pottery teacher?
Email hello@gaysreading.com. We need to know, was your name Clay? Can we connect you back to Jonathan? Bring it all full circle. Thank you so much, Danzy and Jonathan, for being here. Next week, you do not want to miss it. We have one of the hottest authors and one of the hottest books of the fall. And the guest gay reader, so handsome, can currently be seen in a sold-out Broadway show. If you have any guesses, feel free to shoot me a note at hello@gaysreading.com. You don't want to miss it. Like and subscribe. Follow us at Gays Reading. And see you next week. Bye.